No, we just say Institute of Philosophy.
And our final talk for the evening comes from Dr. Dušan Dožudić. Dr. Dožudić is with the Institute of Philosophy in Zagreb. There are fond memories of previous conferences where he has patiently endured my always bugging questions. It is a pleasure for me to be able to welcome Dušan at the Russell 150 conference. His talk today is titled Frege's Rejection of Russellian Facts. Professor Dožudić, please take it away.
Okay, thank you, Andre. I would like to thank you and all the organizers in Bucharest for organizing the conference, and all the participants also for the wonderful presentations and quality discussions. So first, let me start by saying what I mean by Russellian fact. I will use this term Russellian fact, or just fact, in quite a non-technical way, just to separate Russellian facts from Frege's facts. So what I mean by Russellian fact is, in fact, some intuitive idea we have about facts, and that is that they are some kind of truth makers which objectively exist in the world, and which makes our thoughts and our sentences true. So these are not true thoughts in the way Frege thought about facts. So I will include here among Russellian facts also Russellian propositions, and also states of affairs, situations, and all other similar entities which we could all together call facts. So this is really non-technical term, and I think that Frege thought about that in a similar way. Okay, so I will just start with some initial thesis I will have, and then I will proceed with my analysis. So can you see the slide moving?
Not yet, I'm afraid, but if you, yes. We can.
Okay. So there is a non-trivial continuity in Frege's criticism of Russellian facts from 1904 to 1919, the period in which Frege confronted several Russellians. So Russell, early Wittgenstein in 1913, Jordan, and then Wittgenstein again at the time of finishing Tractatus. The non-triviality manifests itself in the fact that Frege in that period appealed to the same line of thought in each particular case. In all these cases, Frege argumentation relies on the part-whole principle, that part of a whole is part of the whole. Frege's animosity towards facts is evident is evident even in his early writings, where he did not address facts explicitly. So this is manifested in the fact that he proposes truth values as meanings of complete declarative sentences, and the animosity towards facts is part of the reason why he abandoned the category of judgeable content. And I'm less certain about this thesis, so we can perhaps discuss it in discussion. Further on, Frege's criticism of facts is part of his longer argument against a family of entities closely resembling facts, such as heaps, aggregates, systems, sets, classes, and so forth, in, for Frege, important respects. The argument against aggregates started as soon as Frege confronted Booleans and other logicians immediately after publishing the Begriffsschrift in 1879. But this criticism of aggregates began to resemble his later explicit criticism of facts only after his 1884 criticism of Mill's, as he calls it, gingerbread or Babel arithmetic, which Mill founded on the part-whole principle. So working on the criticism of Mill and turning the part-whole principle against him inspired Frege to apply analogous argumentation to other cases. And although Frege categorically rejected facts in a number of his later writings, one can find that he unintentionally slips into reference to facts. So given the above claims, I find it useful to divide Frege's relevant writings, including letters and manuscripts, into three periods. The first period is from publishing the Begriffsschrift in 1879 to his introducing the sense-meaning distinction, so sometimes at the end of 1880s. The second period is from that time to his explicit addressing problem of facts in correspondence with Russell in 1804. And then third period is from the correspondence with Russell to his correspondence with Wittgenstein in 1919. So given the proposed divide, I will start in the middle and focus on Frege's introduction of truth values, as he calls them, the true and the false, as meanings of declarative sentences. In my own experience, students are often surprised to learn that Frege doesn't extend the compositionality of senses of complex expressions to the compositionality of meanings of sentences. A sense or a thought expressed by a sentence is composed of senses that belong to parts of that sentence. But the meaning or truth value designated by a sentence is not composed of meaning designated by parts of the sentence. Students typically find this unappealing, and Frege from the start anticipated such a reaction. So he writes in his function and concept, I do not fail to see that this way of putting it may at first seem arbitrary and artificial, and that it would be desirable to establish my view by going further into the matter. And then he directs the reader to his forthcoming paper, Über Sinn und Bedeutung, or Sense and Meaning. And one should know that Russell was the first critic of Frege's idea about truth value, and Wittgenstein was the second one. So what students expect to get from Frege is looking something like this. You have a sentence, this sentence has some kind of content or meaning, and in virtue of that meaning, we are able to say something about the world. So in a way, we designate with the sentence some state of affair or effect in the world. But what we get in Frege looks something like this. So by a sentence, we express a thought, and this thought represents in a certain way what Frege calls the true or the false. And all true sentences designate one and the same thing, and all false sentences designate one and the same thing. So the question is, what justifies Frege's thesis that truth values, rather than facts, are meanings of complete declarative sentences? And in Frege's next paper, to which he refers a reader, first one, Frege provides three substitution arguments for the thesis. The first one goes as follows. If names A and B have the same meaning, but a different sense, substituting A for B in a sentence A is F changes the thought the sentence expresses, but not its truth value. The second argument is that if the name A has a meaning and name B doesn't, and if both A and B have a sense, by substituting A for B in the sentence A is F, the resulting sentence will lose its truth value, but will still express a thought. And the final argument is that if in a true complex sentence P and R, we substitute the sentence P for the sentence Q, which sets truth value as P, but expresses a different thought, the truth value of the complex sentence will not change, although the thought will. And at a number of places, Frege writes as if no alternative to his proposal is even possible. For example, he says, if we are dealing with sentences for which the meaning of their component parts is at all relevant, then what feature except the truth value can be found that belong to such sentences quite generally and remains unchanged by substituting of the kind just mentioned? And further on in a letter to Russell, he says, now, what is this object if it is not the truth value? But in fact, the above arguments do not uniquely support truth values. They are equally compatible with facts. So I will just go through the first argument and I will skip the other two. So the modified argument runs as follows. If names A and B have the same meaning, but a different sense, substituting A for B in the sentence A is F changes the thought the sentence expresses, but not the fact it designates, since constituents of the fact will remain the same. And we can do the same for the other two arguments. So as it appears, none of Frege's arguments discussed so far support uniquely the introduction of truth values. Admittedly, there is an additional argument for truth values in Frege's later writings, which Frege never explicitly advertised, which apparently does support truth values and opposes facts. It is based on the analogy between sentences and complex substantial expressions. The point is that the meaning of an expression 2 plus 3 is not a complex entity composed of the meanings of expressions 2, 3, and the sign plus, and the same holds for sentences. But the problem with this argument seems to be that if one already doesn't have some independent reason to abandon facts, the above comparison cuts both ways. So if facts are abandoned, there is a substantial similarity between the two types of expressions. But if facts are not abandoned, it turns out that the two types of expressions do not function the same way, and that there is a substantial difference between sentences and any substantial expressions. Given that Frege's original arguments do not support truth values uniquely, we may suppose one of the following. Either facts have not occurred to Frege at the time as an option, or he failed to realize his original argument supports facts as well, or he had other reasons not to include facts in his conception, but didn't find it necessary at the time to explicitly argue against them. And I will assume the last possibility. In that case, one may search for Frege's reasons for discarding facts in favor of truth values in his earlier or in his later writings. There is no doubt that straightforward reasons for discarding facts do exist in his writings after 1903. He explicitly criticized facts in them, but I do not think that these also reflect the initial reasons he had for discarding facts in the early 1890s. I propose that his initial reasons lie in his earlier writings, written before the sense-meaning distinction was even introduced, and they are related to his criticism of Mill in Grundlagen in 1884. I will not go into details about Frege's criticism of Mill, so I will only point out what I think it was crucial later for Frege's criticism of facts, and that is Mill's idea that fundamental principle of arithmetic is the part-whole principle. And in addition to that, Mill talks about observable facts as opposed to things. Observable facts are objective part of the world. Facts contain things as their parts, and these things also have parts. And for something to be a whole, its parts have to be joined together. One of Frege's objections to Mill goes as follows. He writes, there are various manners in which an aggregate can be separated into parts, and we cannot say that one alone would be characteristic. For example, a bundle of straw can be separated into parts by cutting all the straws into half, or by splitting it up into a single straw, or by dividing it into two bundles. At this point, Frege turns the part-whole principle against Mill. The moral of the passage seems to be that the possibility of splitting parts of an aggregate is not compatible with the assumed fixed structure of that aggregate. Apparently, the same objection could be directed against any other complex entity of which one requires to have a fixed structure, but whose parts might be further divided in different equally valid ways. Perhaps the first victim of this way of thinking was then Frege's own judgeable content from his early writings. Sometimes in late 1880s, Frege abandoned the category of content and replaced it with the sense-meaning distinction. The distinction between object and concepts, or more generally functions, survived, but now they're regarded as meanings, not as content. And judgeable content, which are complex entities composed of objects and concepts, completely disappeared. In Frege's own words, they were split now into thoughts and truth values. By 1884, Frege abandoned the identity of content, which he introduced in the Griffith, reducing its three applications as identity by conditional and definition to a single one for definition. At the same time, he started intensive investigation of numerical identities. So there is no doubt that abandoning the category of content came as a result of Frege's attempt to cope with epistemological aspects of identity statements. But the question is this the whole reason for abandoning the judgeable content? Now, Frege never explicitly addressed the matter of the nature of judgeable content the way he later did the nature of thoughts, but from his scattered remarks about it, we gather the following. Judgeable contents are composed of objects and concepts. They can enter into causal relations. They substantially depend on their parts. So if one removes a concept from a judgeable content, one is left with an object, not a judgeable content, and vice versa. By that feature, such contents resemble aggregates more than they resemble extensions of concepts, which exist independently of and prior to objects in them. There is the primacy of the judgeable content over its parts. One derives objects and concepts from the content, not vice versa. And there are always several ways in which a judgeable content can be split into objects and concepts. Now, given the characterization, I do not think it is unlikely that at one point it occurred to Frege that in some cases there might be no substantial difference between facts or aggregates and judgeable contents. In a decade to follow Frege's introduction of the sense-meaning distinction, at a number of places he addresses the old issue of the two competing conceptions of class, and he adopted the criterion nicely summarized in his paper on Schroeder in 1895. He says, the domain calculus, in which the fundamental relation is that of part to whole, must be wholly separated from logic. And a couple of years later, in a letter to Russell, Frege writes, a whole, a system, is held together by relations, and these are essential to it. If we are given a whole, it is not yet determined what are the envisaged as its parts. For wholes or systems, we have the proposition that a part of a part is part of the whole, but we must not then regard classes as systems. For the bearer of number, as I have shown in my Foundations of Arithmetic, paragraph section 23, and this is particularly the section where he criticizes Mill, and I have quoted it earlier, is not a system, an aggregate, a whole consisting of parts, but a concept for which we can substitute the extension of a concept. But as it will turn out, Frege thought that the criterion of the applicability of the part-whole principle is not restricted to the matter of class exclusively. So the first case we have in the correspondence between Frege and Russell, which culminated in 1904. So at one point in the Frege-Russell correspondence, the focus of the dispute shifts when Frege asks Russell what is a Satz for him. And that new topic culminated in 1904 with the disagreement over the nature of thoughts. So Frege famously writes to Russell, truth is not a component part of a thought, just as Mont Blanc with its snowfields is not itself a component part of the thought that Mont Blanc is more than 4,000 meters high. And Russell equally famously writes back, I believe that in spite of all its snowfields, Mont Blanc itself is component part of what is actually asserted in the proposition Mont Blanc is more than 5,000 meters high. And Frege repeats the point in his 1906 manuscript Introduction to Logic. He says, but we cannot say that an object is part of a thought as proper name is part of the corresponding sentence. Mont Blanc with its masses of snow and ice is not part of the thought that Mont Blanc is more than 4,000 meters high. For the present context, it is particularly interesting to note what exactly Frege objects to Russell and repeats 2 years later. Typically in the literature, the Frege-Russell dispute in the 1904 is presented as a dispute over the nature of propositions. But authors often fail to notice or stress that Frege's point in the quote is a bit more complex than that. Frege doesn't merely object that an object, in this case Mont Blanc, cannot be part of a thought, but he says Mont Blanc with its snowfields. So given Frege's writings from 1804 onward, I do not think that this formulation is accidental. Although Frege at this point doesn't explicitly explicate the argument behind the remark, I think that he has in mind the argument that exploits the part-whole principle, similar to the one he offered in an earlier letter to Russell concerning classes. And this assumption is firmly supported by Frege's subsequent arguments against facts. Whether Russell realized what Frege's point was when he used the phrase in his response in spite of all its snowfields or not is hard to tell. So the next case we have comes a couple of years later. So in a letter to Russell in 1912, Wittgenstein writes, I had a long discussion with Frege about our theory of symbolism, of which I think he roughly understood the general outline. He said he would think the matter over. The complex problem is now clearer to me, how very much that I may have solved it. So as it turns out, it seems that Wittgenstein discussed the complex problem with Frege, and he reports that now to Russell. And Gitsch in 1977 recollects the following. Wittgenstein told me how he had reacted to Frege's criticism of the Russellian doctrine of facts, doctrines presupposed in the Tractatus. By this view, such a fact or complex as knife to the left of book would have the knife and the book as parts, though Russell, of course, avoided the rude four-letter word part and spoke of constituents. Frege asked Wittgenstein if a fact was bigger than what was a fact about. Wittgenstein told me this eventually led him to regard the Russellian view as radically confused, though at the time he thought the criticism is silly. So it seems to me that if we reconstruct what Frege might have actually objected to Wittgenstein in this remark, we get the following reconstruction. So the argument goes as follows. The question, is a fact F bigger than what is a fact about, either makes sense or it is silly. If one appeals to the part-whole principle, the question seems to make sense. Let the fact F be Jones meeting Smith and Sally in the park. So Jones is here the designated subject, so it seems natural to say that F is about him. Now compare the two things, Jones as a part of the fact and the fact itself. Constituents of the fact, among other things, are Jones, Smith, and Sally. And Jones plus something has to be bigger than John plus nothing, whenever X is middle-sized physical object. Hence, the fact is bigger than Jones. It includes Smith and Sally too. But the theory that forces us to accept that a fact about Jones can be bigger than Jones himself cannot be correct. Hence, Russellian facts are unacceptable. So this seems to me as a possible way to reconstruct what Frege objected to Wittgenstein. Next, we have the correspondence between Frege and Jourdain in 1914. In a draft version of a letter to Jourdain, Frege writes, now that part of the thought which corresponds to the name Etna cannot be Mount Etna itself. It cannot be the meaning of this name. For each individual piece of frozen solidified lava, which is part of Mount Etna, would then also be part of the thought that Etna is higher than Vesuvius. But it seems to me absurd that pieces of lava, even pieces of which I had no knowledge, should be parts of my thought. And the section containing the quote was omitted from the letter Frege actually sent to Jourdain that year, but somewhat abridged point appears in the manuscript Logic and Mathematics the very same year, where Frege writes, let us now look at the sentence Etna is larger than Vesuvius. A part of the thought corresponds to the word Etna, namely the sense of this word. But is the mountain itself with its rocks and lava part of the thought? Obviously not, for one can see Etna, but one cannot see the thought that Etna is higher than Vesuvius. But what are we making a statement about? Obviously about Etna itself. So at this point, one might worry that what is at stake here are thoughts, not facts. But one should keep in mind that Frege is not attacking some hybrid conception of thoughts or propositions here composed of objects and senses, but rather a Russellian conception, and on that conception thoughts or propositions do not in principle differ from facts. And in his letter to Frege, even Russell uses thought a couple of times in this particular sense. And finally, we come to the correspondence between Frege and Wittgenstein in 1919. So after receiving the manuscript of the Tractatus in 1919, Frege wrote to Wittgenstein, "Is every combination of objects an atomic fact? Isn't it of importance by what means these combinations are produced? What is the thing that binds? Can this perhaps be gravitation, as with the system of planets? Is this an atomic fact? You write," and he means the Tractatus, "it is essential to a thing that it can be a constituent part of an atomic fact. Also be a constituent of a fact. The part of a part is part of the whole. If a thing is constituent of a fact, and every fact part of the world, then also the thing is part of the world. I want to have an example for the claim that Vesuvius is constituent of an atomic fact. Then it appears that constituents of Vesuvius must also be constituents of this fact. The fact will therefore also consist of hardened lava. That doesn't seem right to me." So this passage contains two arguments, both exploiting the part-whole principle. So the first argument could be reconstructed in the following way. Things are constituents of atomic facts. Atomic facts are constituents of facts. Facts are constituents of the world. A part of a part is part of the whole. Thus, things are part of the world. But things are not part of the world, as it is clearly stated in the Tractatus. So Frege is offering here a reductio argument. And the same thing goes in the second case. The second argument runs as follows. Things are constituents of atomic facts. Things have parts. A part of a part is part of the whole. Thus, parts of things are constituents of atomic facts, of which things are parts. If Vesuvius is a thing, hardened lava is its part. Thus, hardened lava is constituent of atomic facts, of which Vesuvius is constituent. But as Frege says, that doesn't seem right to me. And a thing to note is that this argument doesn't apply to Wittgenstein if constituents of atomic facts are Wittgenstein's Gegenstanden, since Gegenstanden are simple and cannot be compound. Interestingly, Juliet Floyd, in her paper of 2011, is suspicious of Gitch's remark that Frege's criticism eventually led Wittgenstein to regard the Russellian view as radically confused. She writes, "It is difficult to see how it could have had such a profound delayed reaction if Wittgenstein is supposed to have thought so highly of it as a cognate criticism of his book, and yet never once in his manuscript, which often mentioned Frege, mentioned it. But there is a clear place in Wittgenstein's 1931 manuscript which supports Gitch's remark." Wittgenstein writes, "Complex is not like fact. For I can, for example, say of a complex that it moves from one place to another, but not of a fact. A complex is composed of its parts, the things of a kind which go to make it up. To say that a red circle is composed of redness and circularity, or is a complex with these component parts, is a misuse of these words and is misleading. Frege was aware of this and told me. It is just as misleading to say that fact that this circle is red is a complex whose component parts are a circle and redness. The part is smaller than the whole. Applied to fact and component part, constituent, that would yield an absurdity." And it seems Wittgenstein discussed the same or closely related issue with members of the Vienna Circle as recorded by Weizmann around 1930. So one should also note that Frege's 1919 closing remark, when he says, "That doesn't seem right to me," gains strength only if it is observed from the perspective of his earlier criticism of aggregates. So just as aggregates are for Frege not problematic by themselves, but only if one gives them a substantial role in the logical theory, so too the idea that a part of a fact is part of that fact too is in no way problematic until one gives these facts a substantial role in the logical theory. And this seems to be precisely Wittgenstein's idea in 1931. One can identify facts with complexes, but then one needs another term to talk about facts which are not complexes. And the later are the truth facts, what we mean when we talk about facts. And finally, I just want to mention a couple of places in Frege's later writings where it seems to me that he slips into reference to facts. So for example, Frege writes, judgments are distinctions of parts within truth values. But we must ask ourselves, how can truth values, the true and the false, have parts? And then he later talks about parts of the meaning of the sentence. And in 1902, he says the analysis of the proposition corresponds to an analysis of thought. And this in turn to something in the realm of meanings, and I should like to call this a primitive logical fact. And the next year he says the decomposition into a saturated and unsaturated part must be considered a logically primitive phenomenon. A logical connection into a whole can come about only through this, that an unsaturated part is saturated or completed by one or more parts. A concept can be distinguished within, but that is, it cannot be separated from the context in which it occurs. And then he says the subsumption of an object under a concept, for example, Plato is human being or 2 is prime number. And finally, he says this unsaturatedness of one of the components is necessary since otherwise the parts do not hold together. So it seems to me that all these sentences somehow implicitly point to facts, which Frege was so eager to avoid. So in conclusion, to say that Frege rejects Russellian facts is not to say that he thinks such entities do not exist, but rather that for Frege such entities have no place in the attainable logical theory. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much to Professor Dožudić, and I'm sure everyone joins us in applauding your talk. Time for questions. And if you'd like to ask a question right now, please don't hesitate. Thanks.
So thanks for that talk. I thought that was interesting. I didn't see immediately the connection with the bundle of straw discussion, but I think you made just in Frege's scattered remarks. But when you put them all together like that, I think that you make a strong case there. So I was just thinking, just a couple of observations. In the Begriffsschrift, at the very beginning, he talks about the judgment stroke as being as having the interpretation that what comes after it is a fact. But I don't think that contradicts anything you said. Just an observation. Sorry, I had another observation as well, but.
Concerning the Begriffsschrift, I'm well aware that he mentions facts there, but it seems to me that he uses fact there in a sense is true more than like real fact. So he would probably agree to say, and I think he later does, that I mean it's a fact. It's fact means it's true. So I don't think that he means that in a sense that he wants to explicitly says that judgeable content is a fact in some Russellian way, like some complex in the world. But I think that his other remarks support this interpretation, because at one point in Begriffsschrift, he explicitly says that that there could be causal relations between judgeable contents. And he says this is one of the possible interpretation of conditionality, but it is not an exclusive interpretation. So in some cases there are causal connections, and in some cases there are not. And causal connections can exist between contents only if contents are not some kind of abstract entities, but rather some things like events or situation or state of affairs. So we typically think about events causing other events, but we do not say that, I don't know, a thought can cause another thought in some literal sense. I mean, it can provoke it, but it cannot be part of the cause and effect relationship in the strict sense. So my answer is I would not give too much weight to Frege's fact thought talk in Begriffsschrift.
All right, terrific. Let's see if there's some more some more questions. And if not, let me briefly ask you this. Oftentimes when we talk about facts, different people have different handles on the notion. And obviously, one way to go about it is to say that facts, or whatever it is, perhaps in virtue of which statements that could be made are true, right? This might perhaps be some intuitive motivation behind the circuitous route that Frege took in on sense and reference, such that the meaning of a true proposition was the true, right? Somebody might wonder, if not truth, then what's the handle we hold on what gets to count as a fact, right? And one's reminded of Strawson's quip, right? Of course, facts and statements, but they were made for each other. So I wonder, if there were any kind of metaphysically more robust characterization of facts, where would you say it should come from? Or how should it's clear that you see Frege's resistance to how facts are construed not as a resistance to facts in general, to their bare existence, right? And so how else should we get a grip of them?
Well, first of all, if you do not want to include facts into your theory, then they're just superficial, right? You just don't need them. Mm-hmm. And the same thing goes for aggregates. I mean, if you do not use aggregates in your logical or mathematical theory, then aggregates are just, I don't know, complex physical or whatever things in the world. So if you're asking me how facts understood in non-Fregean way should be characterized, I don't have answer to that. And I think that Frege didn't, when he criticized facts in the case of Jourdain and Russell and Wittgenstein, he just thought about facts in a really rough way as some complex entities which have typically physical parts. And then as soon as you have a complex entity which has physical parts and you use this entity in your logical theory, then all the burden which comes with physical parts is introduced into your logical theory. So your logical theory suffers from all the family of arguments which are based on the part whole principle. So you have to accept that, I don't know, if you define a number in terms of classes and classes in terms of heaps or aggregates or systems of wherever, then your numbers suffer the same problems heaps or aggregates do. And the same thing goes for facts. So if constituents of facts have physical parts, then in a sense, these physical parts also have to be constituents of these facts. But intuitively, that doesn't seem to be right. Why not? Because we think about facts as having some more firm structure, which doesn't depend on parts of the parts. So if I don't know, this table is part of a fact or a Russellian proposition, but we do not infer from that a leg of this table is also part of a Russellian proposition. This is absurd. And this is exactly Frege's point. And as it turns out, Wittgenstein acknowledges this point. He says we must clearly not think about facts as constituents, because as a complexes, because complexes are complex entities located into space and time, and you can move them from one place to another, but you cannot move a fact in the same way. It is absurd. So we have to think about facts in completely different way. And of course, Wittgenstein is not suggesting in 1931 that we should regard facts as Fregean facts, as some kind of true thoughts, because this would be also absurd for him. So I don't know what was Wittgenstein's ultimate answer, but I think his points regarding Frege's criticism and Russell conception is quite clear up to that point.
So can I ask a very brief follow-up about this? And this is going to be a very undergrady question, okay? This is very half-baked, but, and you might have addressed this somehow, but and I missed it. But so clearly it's ludicrous to say something like this. My knee is a part of me, and I'm a part of the population of Romania, therefore my knee is a part of the population of Romania. Clearly that's a mistake, right? And so why isn't the immediate answer to that the fact that these are different parthood relationships? That it's one thing for my knee to be a part of my organism, and it's another thing for me as an individual to be a part of the population of Romania. And so without denying the parthood principle, presumably that's a principle that applies to one and the same parthood relation. It doesn't apply to different parthood relations that are combined, right?
Well, in fact, Frege at a couple of places explicitly says that we can use the word part in different ways. So it is one thing to say that your knee is part of your leg or your body, and it is completely different thing to say that you are part of the extension of a concept, being what was the example, or when we say that sense which belongs to the name Socrates is part of a thought that Socrates is, I don't know, Greek. And it is clear that in his later writings, Frege was really bothered by all this metaphorical talk when he says that senses are parts of thoughts, or that simple concepts are parts of complex concepts and so forth. And he always stresses that this is just a metaphorical use to make a certain point, to make some kind of elucidation, but this is not a technical use. And he explicitly says, I think somewhere in Logical Investigations, that we would have to invent some completely new vocabulary to correctly represent the relations between parts and whole in a logical sense. So he also says at a couple of places that we should distinguish the part-whole relation in a physical sense and the part-whole relation in a logical sense. So when we are saying that, I don't know, you are part of the population of Romania, then we are talking about some kind of logical relations. I mean, we want to say that you are part of the extension of this concept. But we are not saying that a population of Bulgaria is some kind of aggregate which is composed of parts which are mutually linked together and which compose a system or a whole. So this is the whole dispute between two conceptions of class. So on the one hand, we have Frege, who says the only way to understand classes is to define them as extensions of concepts. And in that sense, members of class are completely irrelevant for the existence of the extension, because the concept is the one which dictates what is the extension, not its parts. On the other hand, you have logicians like Schroeder or early Russell or Boole or I don't know who else, and Mill, who think, and perhaps also early Husserl, who think that classes or aggregates or heaps are constituted by linking together elements of these aggregates, and these are two completely different conceptions. So on the Frege part, you have first comes the concept, then extension, then its parts, and on the other hand, you have parts, and from these parts you build classes, and with classes you define concepts, and this is like the complete opposites. And Frege thinks that the argument which relies on the part-whole principle could be easily directed against any of these conceptions of classes and also of facts.
So thanks for that. I have one more quick question, but I'll stop there to give way to others who might have questions that are more elaborate. Jim, please go ahead. You would need to, yes.
Thank you for these interesting remarks. I merely wanted to comment about complexes. I think you would say that an automobile is a complex and can move from place to place. But one could say that a certain place and time occupied by an automobile is a complex. And if one uses complex in that way, it can't move. So that there is some flex in the interpretation of complex. And that bears on the question of whether the complex could move from one place to another.
Okay, but it seems to me that Wittgenstein and Frege would answer. But if you can find one single case of a complex for which it makes sense to say that it moves from one place to another, and you define facts in terms of complexes, then you get the absurd result.
Yes.
So the fact that you can identify complexes for which it doesn't make sense to say that you can move them from one place to another, in no way save the problem, eliminate the problem, because the problems are not complexes for which you cannot say that you can move them or do with them whatever, but the ones which you can move. And this is just one instance of the more general point that you can probably produce a number of analogous absurd observations about complexes, not just that you can move them, but also that you can kick them with your leg, or that you can smell them, or whatever. And all these transformative facts is just an absurd. So if your theory tells you that you can smell a fact, that you can kick it with leg, then there is something wrong with your theory.
Well, the words such as complex can be used in a variety of different ways. And, Wittgenstein saying, say what you like, but be careful. I think that, anyway, this has been very interesting.
Thanks so much. And just to follow up briefly, so if I'm taking a sip of coffee right now, right, there's a fact of the matter, I'm tasting the coffee, right, and I'm doing it now. So presumably the fact in question involves the instant that I'm tasting the coffee at, right? And so that couldn't possibly move to a different instant because it's indexed to that instant. I thought that was the automobile analogy, right? And so as long as facts are like complexes that are indexed to time, space, locations this way, it's unclear to me why the motion would be an issue. Right. So if I'm saying I'm tasting the coffee right now, right, I'm not tasting it in 2 minutes from now. It's the current tasting of the coffee that's the fact.
Okay, so you're suggesting that every physical complex which can be understood as a fact is time and place indexed. Is that your claim?
I was just thinking that such a view would go around the objection that seems to be conceded here in the slide we have right up here.
Okay, but I think that the answer would be okay, but then we will have to consider some other activity directed toward complexes, which is not dependent on possibility of moving from one place to another, or from one time to another, and we would get the same point.
Oh, I see. So
I would have to think about the example, but I don't know. I had a quote somewhere where it says that it's absurd to say that you can see a fact in some way, right?
it is absurd.
I think it's just looking for it.
So if we ask a witness, did you see the thief run with the lady's purse, right? Did you see the facts, we might say? But how's that absurd?
Yeah, okay, I see your point. Yeah, I would have to think about this, but it seems to me that the real point behind this quote of Wittgenstein should be divorced from this particular case. And I think that its moral is that you could perhaps not always, but if you can in principle think of some absurd situation to which your theory forces you to accept its consequences, then your theory has a problem. So we have here example with moving a fact from one place to another. So if you adopt in your theory some metaphysical view that, I don't know, index of time and location and whatever is part of that complex or of that fact, and then you eliminate this particular objection, then you will only have to think of an analogous objection which is not dependent on place and time in this way. And at the moment, I didn't think about this, but I'm pretty sure that I could, I don't know, think about this. And
No, that's right. But the fact defender has survived another day, right?
okay. Yeah.
It's just, yeah. Anyway.
Yeah, but I agree with you that according to early Russell and Russellians, it's quite correct that to say that you can actually see a fact, because facts are complex entities located in the world, so you can actually kick them with your leg in a way. So.
Right, and I think that is you're perfectly right to point at that juncture. That was an incredibly important traditional problem. And when Carnap talked about quasi-analysis and how what's transparent to us in experience are in fact complexes or abstract structures, not sort of the leaves of it. I think that's what sort of he was getting at, but yeah. Thank you. This has been absolutely thrilling. So awesome. If there are any more comments, rejoinders, questions, Greg, please go ahead. I'm afraid we cannot hear you, Greg. Not at all.
Sorry about this.
We can hear you very faintly. If you could maybe amp up the.
Yeah, let me just. Okay.
Excellent.
Okay, sorry about that. So my question is, and I'm not sure if you're thinking about it in these terms, or this just seems obvious to you, but it doesn't seem like you said it in quite these terms, but it seems as though, so Russell has this view of facts that the parts of the parts are parts of the facts. And Frege rejects that, and there's no facts. The true propositions refer to simple things, truth values. There's that remark you said about parts of truth values, but that seems hard to straighten, to be consistent with other things Frege said. So that seems like an anomaly. But Wittgenstein's position really seems in the middle of this, of the two positions, right? You have facts that are complexes. Facts are made up of objects, but the objects that make them up are simple. So it seems as though Wittgenstein is intentionally here carving out a middle ground between them. And it seems to also explain his claims that objects are simple. Maybe there are other motivations as well. But this may have been one of the important motivations for his claiming that objects are simple.
Yes, I didn't think about that, but that might explain the delay reaction which Geach mentions. Just let me find a quote, because here Geach talks about the delayed reaction to Frege's criticism of facts, and so what you are saying explains this delayed reaction. Because in 1919, Wittgenstein still thought that objects, so ultimate constituents of atomic facts or state of affairs, are simple objects which do not have parts. But we know that after Tractatus, Wittgenstein just ditched the idea of Gegenstand in this Tractarian way, because I think he says that he could not think of any example of such objects. So as soon as you discard objects conceived in a way he did in Tractatus, then the objection Frege directed to him become a valid one, right? So is that your point? That as soon as you remove from the metaphysics of the Tractatus, you have a problem with facts. So when you start thinking about facts and atomic facts in some more natural way, not in a way of the Tractatus, then Frege's point makes sense. And that regarded Wittgenstein to discard facts altogether, right? In this Russellian way. And on the other hand, Russell never thought about facts in Wittgenstein way. So for him, facts contain some physical entities, whether they are regular physical objects at one point or sense data or whatever, but they are never simple in Wittgenstein's way, if I'm not mistaken. So if to the extent you can argue that sense data could have parts, then you are in a problem. And to say that every sense data doesn't have parts, it doesn't seem to me to be too compelling. But I don't know about that. Yes. But that's a great point that at the time of writing the Tractatus, Wittgenstein thought the objection is silly because he thought that objects which are ultimate constituents of facts simply do not have further parts. So we cannot apply the part whole principle to them. But as soon as you change your mind about that, then you get the problem. So I think that nicely explains the transition in this 10 years period between publishing the Tractatus and then returning to philosophy in early 1930s.
Can I ask a very brief follow-up on that? So, and I realize we're in overtime here, so thanks for your patience. But it's not immediately, I'm not sure if it's true or false, but it's not immediately clear to me why it would be weird to say the sense data have parts, right? So if I see an apple and I taste it, right? I see its redness, I taste its sweetness. Those seem to be qualia that are part of the larger character of my experience, right? So, I mean, that's not exactly the sense data jargon, but it's not that far removed from it. So with a little sort of conceptual massaging, you could sort of fit it in.
Well, to be honest, I'm not sure how Russell and at what point conceived the sense data, but so if he thought about sense data as ultimately what we perceive as like simple features of the world, then obviously it doesn't make sense to talk about parts of this sense data. But if you get sense data, which is in some way composed of, for example, a shape, a color, and some three-dimensional or whatever, then already it seems to me that in that sense data you can identify some parts which you can in some abstract way separate one from another.
I mean, at some point he's committed to saying that you need to integrate some sense data and others, because that's how he explains perceptual constancy in vision, right? So if I see an object and then I sort of spin around it, right, I'm going to have different 2D images, but I need to integrate the 3D image of what it is that I'm seeing. And so in order to accommodate that, he needs to say something about how the two integrate, right? How the two relate, how you can get from the 2D ones to the 3D one, right? Now, I think he does couch that in terms of sense data, which would commit him to some kind of sense data parthood, but perhaps that's purely of historical interest. I don't know.
Yeah, I really don't know. I would have to read Russell and then decide. So at this point, I cannot answer it. So.
No, but thank you so much. This has been fascinating. Much appreciated, and it's been a long day, and I'm very grateful to all of you who managed to sort of keep thinking about these things and following with all the talks. Thanks so much, Dušan, once again. Wonderful talk. And tomorrow is a brand new day with a brand new set of conferences. I'm very grateful to Angela. She's a keynote for tomorrow, but she's been all day today as well with us. And see you all tomorrow, hopefully, if you can make it. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.